In 2007, a webcomic premiered that you've probably never heard of, created by an artist you can no longer find. It was started by the creator who'd organized the first annual Hourly Comics Day a couple of years before, and featured a simple stick figure-based art style sort of reminiscent of XKCD, or maybe a more muted version of Cyanide and Happiness. In 2008, it nearly won Best Newcomer at the very last Web Cartoonist Choice Awards, losing to Meredith Grand's excellent comic, Octopus Pie. By 2010, art based on the webcomic was being shown in galleries, and by 2012, a Kickstarter for a print edition of the comic raised over $50,000 against a goal of only $8,000. By early 2014, the comic was gone forever. I'm Tabunal, and this, to the best of my ability, is the story of Pictures for Sad Children. Part 1. The Comic. I'd like to give a content warning for the bulk of the video here. If you can't tell by the title, obviously this subject is going to deal with mental health issues. There will, a little bit later, be some discussion of domestic abuse, suicidal ideation, and gender dysphoria. I will give another warning when we approach that portion of the video. Just for now, please be aware, this is going to be a thing. The tragedy of Pictures for Sad Children was its brilliance, and I really wanted to make sure that we review the comic before we get into any of the wild things that happen behind the scenes or start trying to pin down any sort of timeline for the creator. You may notice how hard I'm dancing around naming her, and trust me, we're going to get to that, but for now, suffice it to say that the creator is a trans woman who was not out yet at the time this webcomic was running, and that I'll be referring to her as the creator, the author, or the artist until such time as we discuss the Kickstarter, but anyway. The tragedy of Pictures for Sad Children was its brilliance. The comic was cynical, dark, absurdist, and unflinchingly damning in its critiques of society, but often still sympathetic to its characters, even, if not especially, when they were being terrible. The dialogue was understated, with almost all text exclusively in this passive lowercase with only the mildest of punctuation. It was terrific, and I loved it, so much that I still regularly quote it in my day-to-day life. 2007 to 2009 was a weird, transformative time for webcomics. Broadly speaking, we were moving out of this age of penny arcade and Control-Alt-Deletes and more into the age of like Rice Boy or questionable content or XKCD. Now granted, that's not a hard and fast rule. All of these titles were still popular at the time. It was very much fragmented along internet communities. QC especially had been running for several years. It was just sort of gaining more influence now, and so on. But for purposes of this conversation, it's enough to say that big-time webcomic circles were shifting to different forms of content, and that the medium was really starting to come into its own. Pictures for Sad Children premiered in this transitory phase of the Wild West internet, around the same time that you were seeing the launch of comics like MS Paint Adventures, which would have been 2 years before Homestuck actually started there. The previously mentioned wonderful Octopus Pie, or Kate Beaton's Hark, a Vagrant. For the first 200 or so strips, Pictures for Sad Children followed a loose series of storylines that very absurdist, but most frequently returning to the lives of two characters. Paul, who is a ghost who is dead, and his aimless co-worker, friend, Gary. Paul dies immediately prior to the first strip and reports to work as a ghost after obtaining a sheet to wear. The sheet, we're told, isn't really necessary. Paul just thought it was the right thing for a ghost to do. The Paul and Gary era is almost certainly what people consider to be the heyday of Pictures for Sad Children, and while the comic is frequently surreal, there's a semblance of continuity here. We meet members of their respective families, learn a bit more about their lives. Gary's a lost and lonely post-grad student whose brother is getting married. Paul seems to have been dead inside long before his actual demise, you know. We meet some members of Gary's extended family, who now live in Paul's old apartment and are allergic to everything. They struggle through lives as professional medical test subjects, trying to protect their very serious toddler Maddie from exposure to sunlight. She ends up wearing a pillowcase inspired by Paul. It's with them that we get one of the most poignant, most prescient, most quoted series of strips in all of Pictures for Sad Children, and one I think is a great way to discuss what ended up happening with the comic and its general themes. It comes at the end of a story arc entitled Paul, Who is a Ghost Who Gets His Shit Back and Then Cries About It. Now, Paul has just removed a bathroom mirror from his old apartment, which is revealed to have actually been like a flat screen all-in-one computer with the front camera left on. He takes Gary outside, ignoring Gary explaining his cousin Sarah's hallucinations while Paul hunts for a rock. He finds one. This computer cost me $20,000, Paul says. He cracks it with the rock. Fuck you. Have I ever told you about how nerds destroy the world? Take conspicuous consumption as a lifestyle choice, and combine it with early hardware adoption, and you have great swaths of gadgetry out of stock because they're incrementally better than the last model. Then there are landfills full of functioning electronics, wasted time, resources, money, etc. The best part is that these things were never necessary. It has never mattered how thin a computer is. There's a special kind of nerd, though, who thinks computers will overtake mankind in 30 years, changing humanity in ways incomprehensible to us now, ignoring the third of the world without electricity. So the singularity is the nerd way of saying, in the future, being rich and white will be even more awesome. It's flying car bullshit. Surely the world will conform to our speculative fiction. Surely we're the ones who will get to live in the future. It gives spiritual significance to technology developed primarily for entertainment or warfare, and gives nerds something to obsess over that isn't the crushing vacuousness of their lives. It doesn't matter what you obsess over. Nerds just gotta obsess about something. So you can research alternative energy, or more likely beat a video game very quickly, or draw a cartoon. It's okay though. There are people on the internet who will tell you you're doing a great job. And since people say you're doing great, it's gotta be just as good as other things people say are great. Right? Nerds do not redefine adulthood. They waste it. There's a beat panel there. And just to hammer the point home to Gary and to the reader, Paul adds, I am not telling a joke. You are terrible. Part 2. No anti-capitalist slogans, Callie. There's an extra strip right after that one we just discussed that has Gary's response in it, and we're going to come back to that later in the video because I think it's going to be more appropriate to reflect on the context of that strip with the rest of the story. Now, you may have noticed a certain amount of, let's say, hostility to consumerism in Paul's dialogue there. A lot of Pictures for Sad Children, particularly early Pictures for Sad Children, was based around this sort of satirical depiction of work in a call center and post-grad ennui. This feeling of sort of going out into the world and discovering that it kind of sucks. Gary's enrolled in a correspondence course for a doctorate, though he can't remember what subject it's in. Paul died and went on the world tour he could never afford in life, only to realize that Paris was just another bullshit town. Gary winds up at a family event, his brother's wedding, where everyone casually performs the miracles of Christ in mundane and petty ways. Gary gets to curse the fig tree. And Paul eventually goes to hell, only to wind up in a shitty hotel somewhere in Latin America. As time went on, the content of Pictures for Sad Children leaned increasingly into absurdist humor and critical depictions of capitalism, even as it acknowledged that the systems in place won't be changed or challenged, and that apathy is the natural response to that. After the comic began to drift away from its focus on Paul and Gary, we got fewer and fewer multi-strip stories and more frequent direct satire. An early example of this trend is this strip featuring 2 inked-out stick figures, one of the many departures in art style the creator made, outside a simple house, a parent on the ground and their child on the roof. The parent shouts, "Callie, come down through there." There's a beat. Callie begins to paint on the roof. "No anti-capitalist slogans, Callie." Callie writes, "Abolish the wage system." "I told you, the first world can't revolt without a disaster or economic collapse. For now, you have to work within..." Callie adds the word "now." In later years, some fans would claim that the author's anti-capitalist sentiment came out of nowhere and smacked of hypocrisy, and while it was absolutely hypocrisy, self-aware hypocrisy even, that theme shouldn't really have been a surprise to anyone who'd been reading the comic. Anti-capitalist themes explored through surrealism was a feature of Pictures for Sad Children from the start, and as time went on, the creator leaned into these topics even harder, playing with the format, the medium, and the level of critique, even as the comic experienced continued success. And make no mistake, Pictures for Sad Children was absolutely a wild success. The only reason you haven't heard of it is because it's not on the internet anymore. Nothing emphasizes this success quite like the guests that the creator was able to pull for their guest artist weeks. It was typical for webcomics at this time to ask fellow creators to submit guest posts during like vacation weeks. That's how they took time off. Pictures for Sad Children had guest posts from, among others, Kate Beaton of Hark a Vagrant, Joey Como from A Softer World, Jeff Jacques from Questionable Content, Brian Lee O'Malley, who created Scott Pilgrim, Aaron Diaz of Dresden Kodak, and the inimitable Casey Green, author of many comics, including Gun Show, but also famous for being the creator of the This Is Fine meme. As the notoriety of Pictures for Sad Children grew, however, so did its departures from formula. During the infamous Long John Silver's period, the webcomic site was briefly recolored in garish yellow and blue. Everything on the homepage was rebranded to look like the North American fast seafood chain Long John Silver's. Comics such as You've Got Lupus, Buddy inserted blatant faux marketing copy about Long John Silver's being an active member of the community. This short phase culminates in a comic in which a Long John Silver's employee asks a young girl to watch as he repeatedly submerges his arms into a deep fryer, just screaming. They scream at each other in turn, and she begs him, please stop, and when he finally withdraws his noodle stick figure arms from the fry station, they've twisted to spell the words Long and John. The girl stares in horror for 2 beat panels before lifting her hands in the air and saying, Silvers! After this, the site reverted to its monochromatic color scheme with a blog post explaining that the legal team for Long John Silver's had reached out with a cease and desist. And yeah, of course, that was probably just part of the joke and not literally true, but I'm not totally certain, and I don't think anyone is. I mean, it was probably a troll. We know it wasn't actually an approved marketing campaign from Long John Silver's the way the blog post claimed, but the only confirmation of that even is a bit of a throwaway in the Kickstarter update, which again, we will discuss later, where the author says, the lies I've told have been lies like, I'm being sponsored by Long John Silver's and making comics no marketing department would approve. So we know it wasn't sponsored, but the jury's sort of out on the C&D, like, it could go either way. And the point I'm driving at here is, not only would the artist never tell us, but we could never tell to what degree the information she offered was literally true at all. Part 2.5, Kayfabe. Let's take a break from the comic for just a second to talk about kayfabe. Kayfabe is a term originating in professional and sideshow wrestling, first attested in the 1930s, and it essentially means to stay in character while around people who aren't involved in the show business, who don't know anything about wrestling being scripted. Andy Kaufman was a famous comedian active in the 70s and 80s, who was well known for constructing these like huge elaborate ruses and around these characters and bits he was playing, and committing to them in these stunning displays of kayfabe and anti-humor. For example, he played this loud and repugnant lounge singer character, right, named Tony Clifton. It was one of his recurring stand-up bits. Tony Clifton would literally book shows and events, like, as a separate person. You wouldn't be buying a ticket for Andy Kaufman, you'd buy a ticket for Tony Clifton.
That's it. And his name is Tony Clifton. Yay!
During the filming of an episode of the sitcom Taxi, on which Kaufman was a regular cast member, Andy Kaufman convinced the producers to hire Tony Clifton to play a guest role. Kaufman, as Clifton, showed up to filming late and, without going into too much detail, was deliberately pretty offensive to the cast and crew. They went on to fire Clifton from the role, and they called Kaufman to discuss it, and Kaufman says, oh, you know, he understood, just please fire Clifton in person. and make it about Clifton's lateness instead of his onset behavior so as not to harm the, again, fake man's reputation in Hollywood. So they go to fire Clifton, who is just Kaufman, and he makes this big scene. He has to be thrown off the set, and Kaufman, returns to work the next day as though nothing had happened. It wasn't him. Andy Kaufman was so well known for staying in character like this that to this day, some people believe his death 38 years ago was a hoax. And Tony Clifton still occasionally appears on stage, played by Kaufman's friend Bob Zamuda, of course. I mean, probably. This is what I mean when I say that nobody seems totally sure whether or not the Long John Silver's legal threat was part of the bit. The author of Pictures for Sad Children never really broke kayfabe. She was excellent at obscuring her intentions, her thoughts and feelings behind these shrouds of satire and parody, to such a degree that I don't think any of us as readers ever truly knew what she meant, and what was just another layer of the joke. We never knew who she was. And the kayfabe, the surrealism, continued to escalate until the Kickstarter. Part 3. Pretending to be depressed for profit. Now, content warning again, this is where we're going to get into those discussions of mental health struggles, domestic abuse, suicidal ideation, gender dysphoria. I'll put a time up right here that you can skip to when we've safely moved past most of that. In 2012, the author of Pictures for Sad Children launched a Kickstarter campaign to print the second volume of her work, entitled Sad Pictures for Children. The Kickstarter had a goal of $8,000 and raised over $51,000 with a projected fulfillment date of sometime in the summer of 2012. By this time, the comic had become even more surreal, with the artist frequently adjusting media and styles to unsettling effect. Of particular significance was a comic drawn inside a physical notebook in which a father asserts that a wasp sting killed, your grandmother, but now she is inside the wasp. The wasp has become her. The comic ends with a funeral for the wasp, and it features an open casket that's an actual, physical cutout of the notebook with a dead wasp embedded in it. And remember that wasp. The wasp comes back. So, Kickstarter funded and in hand, the project pretty quickly fell to that most honored of Kickstarter traditions, delays. In July 2012, the author posted a public update to the Kickstarter campaign with the title, "My Life Was Ruined by a Ghost Train." It was this surreal story, with accompanying comics actually on the main site. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but the between the lines gist of things was that the author's computer may or may not have failed and destroyed all her work on the book, and that the author had decided to completely rework the project. 2 months later, on September 19th, the author posted another update. This one was called, "I've been pretending to be depressed for profit, and I'm sorry." And it was a hornet's nest. In it, the author claimed to have been faking depression for clout and artistic purposes all along, and apologized for the possibility of dragging other borderline cases into full depression for her own enrichment. It was pretty clearly written in the dreamy, satirical style, which was typical of the comics blog's posts, just more intense. The update had an associated blog post with the original version on the original website, which I haven't been able to find preserved anywhere, but I remember it calling out other famous creators, specifically Jeff Jacques of Questionable Content, possibly Tim Buckley of Control-Alt-Delete, that's mentioned in some contemporary Reddit posts that still exist, for faking their own depression for profit as well. The Kickstarter update's still visible online as of this writing. It's quite a read. And at the end of the post, the author adds, almost as an afterthought, that the book is being delayed to the end of the year. There's a certain amount of controversy about this at the time, with readers not sure to what degree the author was joking, and trying to comment in defense of, the other creators that were mentioned. Tumblr was outraged, Twitter got in on things, but the comments still attached to the post on Kickstarter seemed to indicate that the more loyal readers mostly felt like they were still in on the joke. 3 days later, another update went up. "I've been pretending to have depression for profit, and I'm sorry." Now, I'm not going to read the entire post here, but there are some key excerpts that I want to go over. She wrote, "It was easy to pretending to be depressed. I sat down and wrote around 650 words over the course of 2 days. One of the days I was writing, A roommate with anger problems I was kicking out of my apartment choked me and broke my drawing desk because of how strongly he felt emotions that he could not seem to express in another way. For most of this year, I've been taking 40 milligrams of citalopram and 150 milligrams of bupropion every day. I have no idea what they are, or what they do, or how the human brain works. If I listened to a neurologist explain how the brain works, I would continue to have no idea how the brain works, but I would learn some new words. I knew that people with depression, and people pretending to have depression, would be capable of conceiving a world where, despite all this, I was still a person who would choose to dismiss the validity of their experiences and pain. I knew that when depressed people expressed this sentiment towards me, despite my attempts to form a connection with them, I would feel wounded for a short time, and I would imagine that everything I had done could be easily wiped out in the minds of all the people I want to connect with. I am attempting to make a home for myself, where I feel safe emotionally and physically. I have lived off of very little money for the majority of my time as a cartoonist, but chose this lifestyle because the desk jobs I've worked have helped make me desire to die. The idea of a happy person drawing hundreds of thousands of compulsively melancholic stick figures for profit is a funny idea. The idea that a person could believe that all depressed people are faking it is funny. It would be funny if a mental illness caused someone to write the previous update in a sincere way. It would be funny if a mental illness caused me to write the previous update in an insincere way. It would be funny if the mental illness you have makes you interpret these words in this order in the way that you do. The next update to the Kickstarter came pretty quickly, and it was called, "It is impossible to pretend to do or say anything, and my comics have never been about depression." And this one's pretty blatantly like a satirical effort to find the right things to say to make controversy go away, right? This is where the kayfabe starts to be a real problem in interpreting the story of Pictures for Sad Children. Because it's tempting to read this, right, as like this refutation of the previous post, another layer of satire and pretending to pretend the whole bit. It's just as easy to read this as a return to form, after the previous post revealed some raw truth about the author's life. What we do know is this. The author seems to have been living in a dangerous and abusive situation. The author was probably experimenting with DMT around this time, the subject of another comic that seems to be lost to the internet. The author was, if not actually in treatment, certainly struggling with some pretty severe mental health issues. The author was struggling against the weight and expectations of her parasocial relationship with her fans. And the author's readers seemed to feel, by and large, in on the joke, that I'm not actually convinced anymore was ever a joke. But things with the Kickstarter seemed to go back to a certain value of normal after this, with updates kicking back up towards the beginning of 2013, revealing the production process of the book. We would later discover that most of the funds raised by the Kickstarter, the whole $51,000, would be gone by the end of this production process. And the reason they were gone, near as I can tell, is that several iterations of the book were printed and designed and revised to include a triangular paper chamber, a cutout in the center of the book, which was specifically purchased and prepared with dead wasps to be included in each and every copy to complete the real experience of that fucking wasp comic we mentioned earlier. There wouldn't just be photos of the page with the wasp like there were on the website, no. An astounding amount of money and labor went into making sure that the wasp happened. The first copies of the book started to trickle out in September of 2013, going to the lowest tier of backers first. By the end of October, the author started soliciting for additional funds on the Kickstarter to help fund shipping for the rest of the rewards. The response to that was less than charitable. Over the next few weeks, the author resorted to selling original art to try and help complete the project, and began to post increasingly, I'm going to say desperate, appeals for aid and expressions of disgust for the whole thing. The Kickstarter went silent for a bit, and then it happened. On February 27th, 2014, the author posted a new update to the Kickstarter, simply titled, "It's Over." The post, which is still visible on the Kickstarter update page, begins with a video. The author was burning 127 copies of the book, one for each email she had received so far in 2014 from backers asking where their books were. Below the video was a manifesto approximately 4,400 words long, longer than the actual script of this video so far, beginning with the words, "Affluent people, please defend your desire for affluence and participation in capitalism. Not to me personally, in public. Please choose from one of the following titles for your publicly posted essay. I worked hard and I get to live in a nice house. Other people work hard and do not get to live in a nice house. I like this and I want this to continue." The post continues for quite a while in a sporadic fashion, lamenting the state of the world and the oppressive nature of capitalism, reminiscing about the author's childhood and experiences with affluence, admitting that the author will not be shipping any more books or providing any other refunds, and that her personal bank account had only $750 remaining in it, that her PayPal was tapped out, that she regretted ever paying down on her student loans using sales from the first book. She referenced an earlier backer-only post in which she had apparently discussed her gender dysphoria, and raged against the entitlement of those fans who felt wronged by these developments or who harassed her trying to get their rewards. In this Kickstarter update, for the first public time, the artist referenced her gender identity, and it was in the most on-brand way possible. It was through a hypothetical conversation with a strawman capitalist Kickstarter backer, right? The strawman says, "You are a damn idiot. What are you going to change, Mr. Internet Man?" Well, first of all, I'm not a man, I think. Oh my god! Shut up! Oh my god! And the update carries on like that. This sort of faux Q&A, discussing the artist's untenable living situation and her financial struggles and berating the entitlement of the higher tier Kickstarter backers. At the end of the update, she wrote, "I stopped reading my Kickstarter messages in January. I may not log into Kickstarter again. I don't know if I'll read the comments on this post. If I get a lot of emails, I will delete my email address. I'm not sure where I'll post next, or when, or what I'll say, or what will have happened, but I look forward to it." This update sort of blew up the internet. The headline was, in a nutshell, that a webcomic creator had scammed her Kickstarter backers. And here's the thing, that Long John Silver's quote from earlier, it was from this update. Here's the full passage. "The lies I've told have been lies like, I'm pretending to be something that's impossible to pretend to be, and that I never said I was. And I'm being sponsored by Long John Silver's and making comics no marketing department would approve. If it is exhausting for you to individually evaluate each thing you read to see how it coincides with your experience and understanding of reality, you probably shouldn't pay attention to me." I absolutely recommend the full update if you have time to read it. It's painful and raw. It works in references to Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener and compares both capitalism and the burning of the books to Calvinism, another unfeeling patriarchal religion to reject from my life, the author says. But that thing she says there, that crack about how if you feel the need to evaluate each statement made by her as genuine, you shouldn't be reading Pictures for Sad Children, that acknowledgement of the kayfabe, that's kind of how you knew it was over. She broke character. She was struggling. And then she vanished. Part 4. My life is not an ARG. In the aftermath of the Kickstarter breakdown, a few key things happened about which we only have like a limited amount of information. What I can verify is as follows. Everything associated with Pictures for Sad Children, as it existed up to this point, was nuked from the internet. The site was gone. Social media went dark. What remained of the author's work existed only as PDF rips and downloads, with no surviving trace of the alt text that made up so many of the original comics' actual punchlines. Max Timken, the guy from Cards Against Humanity, ended up taking over the Kickstarter long enough to distribute what books remained. The author vanished from the internet. What happens next is murky. Here's what I do know. For a while, the creator's old Twitter is taken over by someone calling herself Mary Graves, possibly a reference to the 19th century Unitarian minister Mary Graves, who claimed not to be the author in an unconvincing satirical writing style, clearly that of the author, and claimed that the author, under their dead name, was dead. Mary Graves had a Tumblr, which is also now defunct, and wiki edits from that period debate whether or not this was the author. It was. It almost certainly was. Fans began to form book-sharing chains, Google Drive backups of the comic, and a Reddit community dedicated to discussing and sharing Pictures for Sad Children, only for a different, also now deleted account, also claiming to be the author, to post there asking that they cease and desist, and requesting that anyone who sees her work shared online file DMCA takedowns on her behalf. She wrote, "Please don't try to contact me. Please don't tell me you liked my comics, or that you hope things are better. Please leave me alone. I can verify that the original comic has been almost entirely scrubbed from the Internet Archive, though through takedowns like that. It appears her PayPal subscription has been intermittently active, under the name Jane or Janet Harbinger. The comic or comics by her seem to pop in and out of existence. As of this writing, the original website domain for Pictures for Sad Children links to some sort of like Indonesian spam site. The Wikipedia page for Pictures for Sad Children has update logs going back at least 6 years as of this writing, with editors debating proper names, pronouns for the creator, notability. And the same is true for her TV tropes entry, with edits cropping up every time we get a potential glimpse of her online presence. It appears the author gave an interview to Input magazine last year, the only source I can find for her current activities or for the name that seems to be her true name now, Simone Veil. Even that's possibly a reference to the deceased president of the European Parliament and French women's rights activist. And this article is the only source I can find for that name. It does appear to be legitimate, and it's very heartfelt. I strongly recommend that you read it for yourself. It was touching. It meant a lot to me. I have to assume that the name reference, like I mentioned with Simone Veil, is a deliberate thing. It might be an effort to ensure that Google searches for her name pull up unrelated people to help with the anonymity. In the Input interview, Simone quotes Kathy Change, a climate activist who self-immolated in 1996. And that's the sort of deep cut which is so in character both for the author of Pictures for Sad Children and the kind of person who would be selecting names like that as deliberately obfuscating pen names. Whether any of these even are pen names or her true name isn't clear. That's why I've been so cagey about naming the author in this video. We don't dead name people in this house. And I'm not at all sure that any of her online names, including the dead name attached to Pictures for Sad Children, were ever anything more than noms de plume. I'm not going to quote extensively from the Input article. That rare interview seemed very personal. The author claimed to know Simone. It was a gift just to see that she's still around, still creating sometimes, maybe healing some. Please go read it. Now I haven't totally honored Simone's request for anonymity, I admit. I've made no attempt to contact Simone Veil in the making of this video. Although I have reached out to certain creators regarding some of the key events here, I haven't really received any replies. Simone, if you ever see this, I know you don't want to hear how much you meant to me, or how much I hope things are better, so let me just say thank you. I'm sorry. Let's return to that comic we read earlier about Paul's computer. Remember I said we'd cover the response, right? Paul, and I can't help but looking back, thinking that maybe he was speaking for the author to us, says to Gary and the reader, "I am not telling a joke. You are terrible." Gary embraces Paul. He says, "Come here. I wasn't really paying attention because I just saw one of my relatives and it was weird. Seems like you're mad at some nerds, though. You're afraid of being one kind of asshole, so you're being a different kind. I'm not sure how that helps." Paul pauses, his arm raised. He lowers it. "I ran some blogs, and now I am dead." Gary comforts him. "You destroyed $20,000 today, you dick." And then Paul leaves. He says to tell work he died again, and he vanishes. Like a ghost.